Jake Morrison had been working his ranch in the dusty plains of Montana Territory for nearly 2 decades when he first noticed something peculiar about his prize stallion, Thunder. The year was 1887, and the harsh winter had finally given way to spring, revealing patches of earth that had been hidden beneath snow for months. Thunder, a magnificent black horse with a white blaze down his face, had always been reliable and calm, but lately he'd been acting strange, pawing relentlessly at the same spot near the old oak tree that stood at the edge of the property. At first, Jake dismissed it as typical horse behavior. Perhaps the animal had caught the scent of a gopher or prairie dog. But as days turned into weeks, Thunder's obsession with that particular patch of ground became impossible to ignore. The horse would stand there for hours, scraping his hoof against the earth with an urgency that seemed almost human in its desperation. Jake's wife, Sarah, had also noticed Thunder's peculiar behavior during her morning walks to gather eggs from the chicken coop. She mentioned it to her husband one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon and paint the sky in shades of orange and crimson. The couple had built their life together on this land, carving out a modest existence from the unforgiving wilderness, and they knew every inch of their property like the back of their hands. Neither of them could recall anything significant about that particular spot. Yet Thunder seemed convinced that something of great importance lay buried beneath the surface. Sarah suggested that perhaps they should investigate, but Jake, a practical man who had little time for what he considered foolish notions, was reluctant to waste precious daylight hours on what might prove to be nothing more than his horse's inexplicable fixation. However, as Thunder's behavior became increasingly erratic, affecting his appetite and his willingness to work, Jake realized he had no choice but to take action. The horse was losing weight, and his glossy coat was beginning to look dull and unkempt. Thunder would barely eat his oats, spending most of his time at that cursed spot, pawing and nickering softly as if trying to communicate something urgent to his human companions. One particularly warm afternoon in late April, when the prairie grass was beginning to show its first green shoots, Jake finally decided he'd had enough. He grabbed a shovel from the barn and marched out to where Thunder stood, his powerful muscles tense with anticipation as if he knew his message was finally being heard. The first few shovelfuls of dirt revealed nothing but dark, rich soil and the occasional earthworm. Jake was beginning to feel foolish, imagining what his neighbors would say if they knew he was digging holes based on his horse's whims, when his shovel struck something hard. The metallic clang echoed across the quiet prairie, causing Thunder to whinny excitedly and dance in place. Jake's heart began to race as he carefully scraped away more soil, revealing what appeared to be the corner of a metal box, its surface corroded with rust but still intact after what must have been years buried in the earth. With trembling hands, he worked to uncover more of the mysterious object, his mind racing with possibilities about what it might contain and how it had come to be buried on his property. As Jake continued to dig, the box emerged from its earthen tomb, revealing itself to be about the size of a small trunk, with ornate brass corners that had somehow survived the ravages of time and weather. The lock had long since corroded away, leaving only a rusty hole where it once secured whatever precious contents lay within. Thunder watched intently, his ears pricked forward and his dark eyes fixed on the box, as if he understood the magnitude of this discovery. Jake called out to Sarah, his voice carrying across the ranch, and within minutes she was by his side, her apron dusty from her afternoon chores and her face flushed with curiosity and excitement. Together, they carefully lifted the box from its resting place, surprised by its weight and the way it seemed to emanate an aura of significance that neither of them could quite explain. Back at the house, with the box placed carefully on their kitchen table, Jake and Sarah examined their find more closely. The metal was clearly old, older than their own presence on the land, and the craftsmanship suggested it had once belonged to someone of considerable means. Strange symbols were etched into the lid, symbols that neither Jake nor Sarah recognized, though they seemed vaguely familiar in a way that made them both uncomfortable. Sarah ran her fingers over the mysterious markings, feeling a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of the afternoon sun streaming through their kitchen window. The box seemed to pulse with hidden secrets, and both of them felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension about opening it and discovering what lay within. When Jake finally pried open the stubborn lid, the hinges creaking in protest after their long imprisonment. Both he and Sarah gasped at what they found inside. The box was lined with faded red velvet, and nestled within were objects that seemed to tell a story of violence and mystery. There was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, a collection of gold coins that gleamed despite the years they'd spent in darkness, and most disturbing of all, a human skull, its empty eye sockets seeming to stare accusingly at the couple who had disturbed its rest. Wrapped around the skull was a piece of cloth that might once have been white but had long since turned the color of dried blood, and pinned to this makeshift shroud was a sheriff's badge, its star-shaped surface tarnished but still readable. Sarah's hands shook as she picked up the journal, its leather cover cracked and brittle beneath her fingers. The first page bore an inscription in faded ink that made her blood run cold. The journal belonged to Sheriff Thomas Whitmore, a name that Jake recognized from old newspaper clippings he'd seen in town, stories about a lawman who had disappeared without a trace nearly 20 years earlier while pursuing a notorious gang of cattle rustlers and murderers. The mystery of Sheriff Whitmore's fate had been the talk of the territory for months, with search parties scouring the countryside and rewards offered for any information about his whereabouts. But no trace of the man had ever been found until now. As Sarah carefully turned the pages of the journal, reading aloud the sheriff's final entries, a chilling story began to emerge. Whitmore had been closing in on the gang, led by a man known only as Black Jack Murphy, when he discovered evidence that the criminals had a hideout somewhere on what was now Jake and Sarah's property. The sheriff's last entry, dated just 3 days before his disappearance, spoke of his plan to investigate the area alone, against the advice of his deputies who feared it was too dangerous for one man to handle. He wrote of strange lights seen in the distance, of local cattle going missing, and of his growing suspicion that the gang was using the remote location not just as a hideout but as a base for something far more sinister than simple cattle rustling. The gold coins in the box bore dates from the 1860s, and Jake realized with growing horror that they were likely part of the stolen loot from a series of bank robberies that had terrorized the region during that time. Each coin seemed to carry with it the weight of the crimes that had been committed to obtain it, and both Jake and Sarah felt increasingly uncomfortable handling the cursed treasure. Thunder, who had followed them to the house and now stood outside the kitchen window, seemed agitated, his ears constantly moving and his nostrils flaring, as if he could sense the dark history that was being unveiled within his master's home. But the journal held more secrets than just the story of Sheriff Whitmore's investigation. Hidden between its pages were several folded documents, their paper so fragile that Sarah had to handle them with extreme care to avoid tearing them. The first document appeared to be a map, hand-drawn and marked with various locations around the territory, including a detailed diagram of what looked like an underground tunnel system. The second document was even more disturbing, a list of names written in the same hand as the journal entries. But these names were crossed out with red ink, and next to each name was a date and a brief description of what appeared to be murders committed by Black Jack Murphy's gang. As the afternoon wore on and the shadows grew longer, Jake and Sarah found themselves drawn deeper into the mystery that Thunder had helped them uncover. The journal revealed that Sheriff Whitmore had been much closer to solving the case than anyone had realized, and his final entry spoke of his plan to return to the area with reinforcements to arrest the entire gang and recover the stolen money. But something had gone terribly wrong, and instead of capturing the criminals, the sheriff had become their victim, his body hidden in the very box that now sat on Jake and Sarah's kitchen table, along with the evidence he had died trying to preserve. The skull seemed to watch them as they read, its empty sockets serving as a constant reminder of the violence that had taken place on their peaceful ranch decades before they'd ever set foot on the land. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Sheriff Whitmore's spirit was somehow still present, still seeking justice for the crimes that had cost him his life. Thunder's discovery of the burial site seemed like more than mere coincidence, and both she and Jake began to wonder if their horse had somehow been guided to the spot by supernatural forces seeking to right an old wrong. As evening approached, Jake decided they needed to take their discovery to the current sheriff in town, a gruff but honest man named Bill Harrison who had taken over the position several years earlier. But as they prepared to load the box into their wagon, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about their situation. Hidden in the very bottom of the box, beneath a false bottom that she'd discovered by accident, was another journal, this one bound in black leather and written in a different hand entirely. This second journal belonged to Black Jack Murphy himself, and its pages contained confessions to crimes that went far beyond simple robbery and murder. Murphy's journal revealed that he and his gang had not just been criminals but had been involved in something far more sinister, a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The stolen gold was not just the proceeds of their robberies but payment for assassinations and other illegal activities carried out at the behest of corrupt officials who wanted to maintain their power and influence. Sheriff Whitmore had discovered this conspiracy and had been murdered not just by a gang of outlaws but by order of the very people he had sworn to serve and protect. The implications of this revelation were staggering, and Jake realized that their discovery could potentially expose corruption that might still exist in the territory's power structure. But Murphy's journal contained one final, terrifying revelation that made both Jake and Sarah question whether they should ever have opened the cursed box. The gang leader wrote of a curse that had been placed on the stolen gold by a Lakota medicine man whose family had been killed during one of their raids. According to Murphy's increasingly frantic final entries, members of his gang had begun dying under mysterious circumstances, struck down by accidents and illnesses that seemed to target anyone who had handled the cursed treasure. Murphy himself wrote of nightmares and hallucinations, of feeling constantly watched by unseen eyes, and of his growing conviction that they were all doomed to suffer the same fate as their victims. The last entry in Murphy's journal was dated just days after Sheriff Whitmore's murder, and it spoke of the gang leader's decision to bury the evidence and flee the territory, hoping to escape the curse that seemed to be following them. But according to local legend and newspaper reports that Jake vaguely remembered, Murphy and his remaining men had been found dead just weeks later, their bodies discovered in a remote canyon with no apparent cause of death. The authorities had attributed their deaths to exposure or possibly poisoning from contaminated water, but Murphy's journal suggested a far more supernatural explanation for their demise. As Jake and Sarah sat in their kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of crimes and conspiracies from decades past, they began to notice strange occurrences that they hadn't paid attention to before. The temperature in the room seemed to drop noticeably whenever they handled the gold coins, and several times they could have sworn they heard whispers coming from empty rooms in their house. Thunder, normally calm and gentle, had become increasingly agitated, refusing to enter the barn and spending his nights pacing nervously around the property as if standing guard against some unseen threat. Sarah suggested that perhaps they should rebury the box and pretend they'd never found it. But Jake's sense of justice wouldn't allow him to let Sheriff Whitmore's murder go unavenged, even after all these years. He was determined to take their discovery to Sheriff Harrison and let the law decide what should be done with the evidence they'd uncovered. However, as they prepared for their trip to town the next morning, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes were tracking their every movement, and that their discovery of the buried box had set in motion events that they might not be able to control. The night before their planned trip to town brought with it a series of disturbing events that tested both Jake and Sarah's resolve. They were awakened in the early hours of the morning by the sound of Thunder's frantic neighing, and when Jake rushed outside to investigate, he found his beloved horse in a state of absolute terror, his eyes wide with fear and his body trembling as he stared at something that Jake couldn't see. The area around the old oak tree, where the box had been buried, seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, and Jake could have sworn he saw figures moving in the shadows, figures that disappeared whenever he tried to focus on them directly. Sarah, meanwhile, experienced her own terrifying encounter when she went to the kitchen to make coffee for her shaken husband. As she entered the room, she was shocked to find the box open on the table, its contents arranged in a pattern that neither she nor Jake had created. The skull sat in the center, surrounded by the gold coins in a perfect circle, and the two journals lay open to pages that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly light. Most disturbing of all, new writing had appeared in Sheriff Whitmore's journal, words that seemed to be written in the same faded ink as the original entries but conveying a message that chilled Sarah to the bone. The new writing spoke of unfinished business and the need for justice to finally be served, but it also contained warnings about the dangers that Jake and Sarah would face if they chose to pursue the truth. The curse that had claimed Black Jack Murphy and his gang was still active, and anyone who disturbed the carefully maintained balance between the living and the dead risked becoming its next victim. Yet the ghostly message also suggested that there might be a way to lift the curse and bring peace to the tormented spirits that still haunted the land. if Jake and Sarah had the courage to see their mission through to its conclusion. As dawn broke over the Montana territory, Jake and Sarah made the difficult decision to proceed with their plan to take the evidence to Sheriff Harrison. Despite the supernatural warnings they'd received during the night, they carefully packed the box and its contents into their wagon, along with supplies for what might prove to be a longer journey than they'd originally anticipated. Thunder, though still visibly shaken by his experiences of the previous night, seemed more willing to cooperate now that the cursed objects were being removed from the property, and he allowed Jake to harness him to the wagon without his usual resistance. The ride to town took most of the morning, and during the journey, Jake and Sarah had time to discuss the full implications of their discovery. If the corruption that Sheriff Whitmore had uncovered still existed in the territorial government, bringing the evidence to light might put them in considerable danger. But they both felt that they owed it to the murdered lawman's memory to ensure that the truth finally came to light, regardless of the personal risks they might face. The weight of the box in the back of their wagon seemed to grow heavier with each mile they traveled, as if the spirits of the past were reluctant to be moved from their resting place. Sheriff Harrison's reaction to their story was initially one of skepticism, but his attitude changed dramatically when he saw the evidence they brought him. The lawman had heard stories about the mysterious disappearance of his predecessor, and he recognized immediately that the skull and badge they'd found were genuine. As he examined the journals and read the detailed accounts of corruption and murder they contained, his face grew increasingly grim, and Jake realized that some of the names mentioned in the documents might still be familiar to the current sheriff. The implications of a conspiracy that had reached into the highest levels of government were not lost on Harrison, and he understood that pursuing the investigation might put not only Jake and Sarah in danger but himself as well. However, the discovery of Sheriff Whitmore's remains and the evidence he died protecting was too important to ignore, and Harrison began making plans for a full investigation into the crimes described in the journals. He sent telegrams to federal authorities, requesting assistance with what was clearly a case that went beyond the jurisdiction of local law enforcement, and he began quietly investigating the current whereabouts of the surviving members of the conspiracy that Whitmore had uncovered. Some of the names in the journals belonged to men who were still alive and still held positions of power in the territory, and bringing them to justice would require careful planning and considerable courage. As word of the discovery began to spread through the small community, Jake and Sarah found themselves at the center of attention they hadn't sought and weren't entirely comfortable with. Reporters from newspapers in larger towns began arriving to cover the story, and curious residents came by their ranch to see the spot where Thunder had made his remarkable discovery. The horse seemed to enjoy the attention, preening whenever visitors praised his intelligence and intuition, but Jake noticed that Thunder still refused to go near the old oak tree where the box had been buried, as if he could sense that the supernatural forces associated with the cursed treasure were not entirely gone. The investigation that followed Sheriff Harrison's initial examination of the evidence uncovered a web of corruption and violence that had been carefully hidden for decades. Several prominent citizens of the territory were arrested on charges ranging from conspiracy to murder, and the federal authorities who took over the case praised Jake and Sarah for their courage in bringing the evidence to light despite the obvious dangers they faced. The stolen gold was returned to the banks and businesses from which it had been taken, though much of it had to be distributed to the heirs of the original owners since so many years had passed since the original crimes. Sheriff Whitmore was finally given the proper burial he deserved, with full honors befitting a lawman who had died in the line of duty. The ceremony was attended by law enforcement officers from across the territory, and Jake and Sarah were recognized for their role in solving one of the region's most enduring mysteries. Thunder, too, received recognition for his part in the discovery, with several local newspapers running stories about the remarkable horse whose persistence had led to the uncovering of such an important piece of history. The animal seemed to understand that he was being praised, and his behavior returned to normal once the cursed objects were removed from the property and the truth about the crimes was finally revealed. But even after the investigation was complete and justice had been served, Jake and Sarah continued to experience occasional reminders of their brush with the supernatural. On quiet evenings, they would sometimes hear the sound of hoofbeats that couldn't be attributed to any living horse, and visitors to their ranch occasionally reported seeing figures in old-fashioned clothing walking near the oak tree where the box had been buried. These encounters were never threatening, however, and both Jake and Sarah came to believe that the spirits they occasionally glimpsed were those of Sheriff Whitmore and other victims of Black Jack Murphy's gang. Finally at peace now that the truth about their fate had been revealed and their killers brought to justice. Thunder lived for many more years after his remarkable discovery, becoming something of a local legend and attracting visitors from across the country who wanted to meet the horse that had solved a decades-old mystery. He never again showed the obsessive behavior that had led to the uncovering of the buried box, but he did develop an unusual habit of standing guard near the oak tree during thunderstorms, as if protecting the site from any further supernatural disturbances. Jake and Sarah often wondered if their beloved horse had been somehow chosen by the spirits of the dead to help bring their story to light, and they treated him with the special reverence due to an animal that had played such an important role in ensuring that justice was finally served. In the years that followed, the story of Thunder's discovery became part of the folklore of the Montana Territory, passed down from generation to generation as an example of how justice, though sometimes delayed, will eventually prevail. The oak tree where the box had been buried became a landmark, and many people made pilgrimages to the site to pay their respects to Sheriff Whitmore and the other victims of the conspiracy he had died trying to expose. Jake and Sarah's ranch prospered, perhaps blessed by the grateful spirits of those whose deaths had finally been avenged, and they lived long, happy lives, always grateful for the day their horse's strange behavior had led them to uncover one of the most important discoveries in the history of their territory. The years following Thunder's remarkable discovery brought profound changes not only to Jake and Sarah's lives, but to the entire Montana Territory. As the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed through the ongoing federal investigation, it became clear that Sheriff Whitmore had been on the verge of exposing a criminal network that extended far beyond simple cattle rustling and bank robbery. The corruption had infected every level of government, from local judges who had been paid to dismiss charges against gang members to territorial officials who had received shares of the stolen gold in exchange for their silence and cooperation. The revelation that such widespread corruption had existed for decades sent shockwaves through communities across the region and led to a complete reorganization of law enforcement in the territory. Thunder, meanwhile, seemed to understand the magnitude of what he had helped accomplish. The once agitated stallion now carried himself with a dignity that hadn't been present before his discovery of the buried box. Visitors to the ranch often remarked on the horse's almost human-like intelligence and his apparent awareness of his own fame. Local children would come to see the famous horse, and Thunder would patiently allow them to pet his nose and feed him sugar cubes, while their parents told them the story of how his persistence had led to one of the most important criminal investigations in the territory's history. Jake noticed that his beloved horse had developed an uncanny ability to sense the character of visitors, becoming restless and difficult around anyone with questionable motives while remaining calm and gentle with honest, well-intentioned guests. As autumn arrived and the leaves on the old oak tree began to change color, Jake and Sarah decided to hold a memorial service for Sheriff Whitmore and all the other victims whose names had been found in Black Jack Murphy's confession journal. The ceremony was simple but moving, with Sheriff Harrison reading the names of the dead and local clergy offering prayers for their souls. Thunder stood quietly during the entire service, his head bowed as if he too was paying his respects to the fallen lawman whose remains he had helped discover. Many of the attendees later remarked that they felt a sense of peace and closure during the ceremony, as if the restless spirits that had haunted the area for so long were finally able to move on to their eternal rest. The investigation into the territorial conspiracy continued for several more months, with federal agents working tirelessly to track down every member of the criminal network and recover as much of the stolen money as possible. Several high-ranking officials were arrested and put on trial, their convictions sending a clear message that corruption would no longer be tolerated in the territory. The trials were widely covered by newspapers across the country, with Jake and Sarah's story serving as a symbol of how ordinary citizens could make a difference by standing up for justice and refusing to ignore evidence of wrongdoing, no matter how dangerous it might be to come forward with what they knew. Thunder's fame spread far beyond the borders of Montana Territory, with newspapers in cities like Denver, San Francisco, and even New York running stories about the remarkable horse whose intuition had solved a decades-old mystery. Several writers and reporters made the journey to Jake and Sarah's ranch to interview them about their experience and to meet Thunder in person. The horse seemed to enjoy the attention, often performing for visitors by returning to the spot where he had made his discovery and pawing at the ground, though never with the frantic desperation he had shown before the box was uncovered. It was as if he was demonstrating his accomplishment for those who had come to hear his story. One particularly memorable visitor was an elderly woman named Martha Whitmore, who had traveled all the way from Colorado to thank Jake and Sarah for finally solving the mystery of her brother's disappearance. Sheriff Thomas Whitmore had been her younger sibling, and she had spent 20 years wondering what had happened to him and whether he had suffered before his death. The discovery of his remains and the journals that revealed his heroic efforts to expose the conspiracy had given her the closure she had desperately needed, and she wept as she stood beside the oak tree where his body had been hidden for so long. Thunder seemed to sense the woman's grief and gently nuzzled her shoulder, providing comfort in his own unique way. As winter approached and the anniversary of Thunder's discovery drew near, Jake and Sarah reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed since that fateful day when they had finally decided to investigate their horse's strange behavior. They had gone from being simple ranchers living quiet lives on the frontier to being celebrated figures whose story had inspired people across the nation. More importantly, they had played a crucial role in bringing justice to victims whose voices had been silenced for far too long, and they had helped expose a level of corruption that might otherwise have continued for years, or even decades longer. The territorial government, now cleaned of the corrupt officials who had once held power, established a special fund to compensate the families of Sheriff Whitmore and the other victims of Black Jack Murphy's gang. Jake and Sarah were offered a substantial reward for their role in solving the case, but they declined to accept any money, stating that they had only done what any decent citizen would do when confronted with evidence of such serious crimes. Instead, they asked that the reward money be used to establish a scholarship fund for young people who wanted to pursue careers in law enforcement, ensuring that future generations of lawmen would be well-trained and committed to justice. Thunder's story became the subject of several books and even a stage play that toured theaters throughout the Western Territories. The horse himself seemed largely unaware of his literary fame, though he did appear to enjoy the increased number of visitors who came to the ranch specifically to meet him. Jake built a special shelter near the oak tree where Thunder could stand during his daily visits to the site of his discovery, and many guests remarked on the almost reverential way the horse conducted himself during these pilgrimages. It was as if Thunder understood that he had been chosen for something greater than himself, and that his actions had helped bring peace to souls that had been trapped between worlds for far too long. The supernatural occurrences that had frightened Jake and Sarah during their initial investigation gradually diminished and eventually stopped altogether, suggesting that the spirits that had haunted their property were finally at rest. Sheriff Harrison, who had initially been skeptical about the more otherworldly aspects of their story, became a believer after experiencing several unexplained phenomena during his own visits to the ranch. He often spoke publicly about the importance of listening to intuition and being open to guidance from unexpected sources, using Thunder's story as an example of how the truth has a way of revealing itself when the time is right. As Jake and Sarah entered their golden years, they often sat on their porch in the evening, watching Thunder graze peacefully in the pasture and marveling at the turn their lives had taken because of their horse's mysterious behavior. They had learned that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries come from paying attention to the ordinary world around them, and that even animals can serve as messengers when justice needs to be served. Their story became part of the oral tradition of the territory, passed down from parents to children as an example of how courage and persistence can triumph over corruption and evil. Thunder lived to the remarkable age of 32, spending his final years as a beloved patriarch of the ranch and a living symbol of the power of intuition and determination. When he finally passed away peacefully in his sleep, the entire community mourned his loss, and his funeral was attended by hundreds of people who had been touched by his story. He was buried beneath the old oak tree, near the spot where he had made his famous discovery, and a simple headstone marked his grave with the words, "Thunder Morrison, a horse who served justice." Jake and Sarah, now well into their 70s, stood beside the grave and whispered their thanks to the faithful animal who had changed their lives and brought peace to so many tormented souls. The legacy of Thunder's discovery continued long after the horse's death, inspiring countless other stories of animals whose unusual behavior had led their human companions to important discoveries. The ranch became a pilgrimage site for those interested in the history of the American West and the ongoing struggle between good and evil that had shaped the frontier. Jake and Sarah, in their final years, took great satisfaction in knowing that their willingness to trust their horses' instincts had not only solved a decades-old mystery, but had also helped establish a more just and honest system of government in their beloved Montana territory, ensuring that future generations would benefit from the truth that Thunder had helped bring to light.